Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So yesterday we talked about government debt. Today we're going to talk a little bit about personal debt. I ran across a gentleman by the name of Scott Terrio who's written about consumer insolvency and debt, which is high for governments, but it's also high personally. Scott is a manager of consumer insolvency at a company by the name of, I think it's Hoyes McClollis, licensed insolvency.
Hoyes Michaelis.
Michaelis, I apologize.
Only Ted gets his name right. It's okay.
Licensed insolvency trustees, the largest independent consumer insolvency firm in Canada. And what that means is that Scott files thousands of personal bankruptcies and consumer proposals for Canadians who are in serious debt trouble. Scott, tell me a little bit about what you see right now with personal debt, what you do, and are more people in a situation where they're filing for personal bankruptcies.
Right. Well, what I see is we kind of have front row seats for this stuff, Brian, in the sense that we do a lot of consumer proposals. By far, most of our files are consumer proposals versus bankruptcies. And in a proposal, you're just making a settlement, a legal settlement with your creditor. So we get to see not only the consumer's debt situation, but also how the creditors are reacting. Right, the banks, the lenders, what are they thinking these days? So I've done 7,000 or 8,000 of these over 14 years, almost entirely consumers as opposed to small businesses. Prior to that, I was in sales and marketing. I worked for John Deere for 14 years prior to that. And so some of that skill from sort of the sales background, I think I bring to making people comfortable in what's an otherwise a mortifying situation for them. They're talking to a perfect stranger and they're spilling their guts about their finances. So my job is probably as much about psychology as it is money. I do a lot of writing, places like Maclean's, Money Sense, Canadian Business Magazine, The Globe, The Star, The Post. I do a lot of media commentating. I appear on BNN regularly, just discussing consumer matters, consumer debt matters, because I think I take an educational approach to this, Brian. I think it's a financial literacy thing in this country. And I think if people know what I was fortunate enough to learn about some of this stuff when they were 18 or 20, as opposed to 40, I think they would avoid a lot more pitfalls in life.
You talk in an article I read recently about life events and how those life events impact us fairly dramatically. And I guess, number one, I think you made the point that we don't anticipate how these life events are going to impact us financially, and number two, that we wait too long to react after them. And you talked about divorce, separation, going from two incomes down to one. You talked about job loss, illness, death in the family, car repair bills, home repair bills, gambling, etc. Tell me about this issue about not anticipating the financial impact of life events, not being prepared for it, and then not reacting too quickly enough.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest events obviously are divorce, separation, reduced hours or job loss. Outright job loss is major for personal finance, obviously, or household finance. Business failures when you're the business owner or one of the employees, I suppose. And illnesses, health-related, inability to work. Those are the big four that we see typically. There are also some more macro factors involved that have driven some of this stuff. And, I'm sure you've seen a lot of recent polls and survey data, showing that Canadians are living close to the edge financially every month anyway, paycheck to paycheck kind of scenario. And that has certainly increased, I'd say dramatically in the last 3 years as we have faced three generational issues, probably, Brian, like COVID, who saw an economic shutdown coming, inflation, generational inflation, certainly, and interest rate increases, in a short span of time. And so what that's done is if you're living paycheck to paycheck anyway, and now all of a sudden you're shelling out more for groceries, you lost your job during COVID, so you're still not back on your feet financially. You dipped into debt because of it, or you took government benefits. Now you owe tax on those or whatever. And rate increases have not only driven up cost of living per month for homeowners, but also renters, because it's like, a rising tide, everything goes up. And so, people these days are facing, I'm sure this as a businessman, but there used to be kind of a rule of thumb saying you don't want to spend more than about 30% of your net monthly income on your shelter. Like, that's gone. Right? Like, it's 40 now, and we see 50 or even more. So people, in other words, an entire paycheck is going to rent, and then they have no money for 2 weeks. Well, what do? Well, there's some more data. They go to credit card debt. So that's kind of what we're seeing in terms of what's happening. But the events now, as a result of that, it takes less of an event for things to be a problem. Like, it doesn't have to be a catastrophic event necessarily. It can be something much more, or what otherwise would have been more minor, that drives you into trouble or an insolvency proceeding.
And I think at the same time, we've got personal debts that are at an all-time high. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Scott and talk about this situation, how it impacts us all, and what we can and should do about it. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Often on the show, I focus on government debt because that's clearly a big issue, but I wanted to focus today on personal debt. And our guest to talk a little bit about that is Scott Terrio. He is a consumer insolvency expert at Hoyes Michaelis, licensed insolvency trustees, the largest independent consumer insolvency firm here in Canada. And he therefore files, as he's chatted with us about, thousands of personal bankruptcies and consumer proposals. He says mostly consumer proposals for Canadians that are in serious debt to trouble. Scott, maybe take a step back just for a second. I understand that we've got debt, personal debt, that is twice the level of it is in the United States. That's kind of
we lead the way in some things, Brian. Our credit card debt in this country has now exceeded 100 billion for the first time ever. It was 90 billion this time last year, just over. And there's reasons for that. It isn't just because we're profligate spenders and all that stuff. It's, you look at all the factors that are impacting Canadian households these days. And because we're not traditionally or historically great savers, as compared to our friends to the South, we've had a lot less cushion for our households in the last few years, and we've been hit by, three kind of tidal wave factors in the last, or since 2020. So COVID and economic shutdowns, 3.4 million Canadians lost their jobs instantly in March of 2020. And that had a lag effect, of course, over the last couple of years on people's finances. We've had generational inflation, and we've had interest rate increases that were very high number of increases in a short amount of time. And so those things, what they've done is they have caused people who would otherwise have been able to ride things out a bit, but are living possibly paycheck to paycheck, to dip into credit cards and other credit vehicles. And so that's why you see credit card debt now at 100 billion, and that's going up.
You sent me an interesting chart that showed that if you track insolvencies with credit card debt, it's almost a perfect regression.
Yeah. And I think this matters because people have less room for error, right? And so, as we face tougher and tougher months, because it's important, I think, to remember that most households are month to month. Okay, I think. I sit down with people, 10 people a day, and look at their expenses in detail, and it's very telling to me when you ask someone. I'll give you an example. What's your car payment? I don't say the time period. I say, what's your car payment? I expect to hear back monthly, but what they'll say is $258, and I'll say, for how long? And they'll say, oh, biweekly. They put, like, the car industry has put this out of people's minds, right? Like, they've got it down to biweekly and then weekly, and then so now what they don't want people is to think about their big payment every month, because that's how people live, right? And really, it's nothing for people to be spending $1,000 or $1,500 on a car, because the payments are $600-700, $250 a week or something, and then their insurance and their gas. And so when you have these things impacting households, people at some point will run out of runway. And we were doing okay until prior to 2020, and now a lot of that runway is gone, and that's why you're seeing people resorting to using their credit cards to make ends meet and buy groceries and things like that. We're not talking about going on trips here.
Which is sort of leading to a debt spiral, because the interest rate on those are what, 18%?
Yep. Yeah, minimum. Yeah. And
So
some of the retail cards are high 20s, right?
Worst thing you can do is finance your lifestyle with interest rates that high.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did we get into this situation? How do we get out of it? If you're saying that it's, lifetime generational events, COVID,
Yeah.
interest rates, inflation, it would seem like, we couldn't have been ready for it. Should we have been ready for it?
Well, we should have been in a way. I think what happened is we got carried away. If I back up here for you, like you said, how did we get here? Okay, well, that's a good question, a good way to say it. We had 12 to 14 years of free money at our disposal. Following the great financial crisis of 2008-9, all the big Western countries kind of said, okay, we're gonna drop interest rates to virtually zero. At the time, it was considered an emergency matter or an emergency measure, and it just kind of stayed. And I think what happened is, to put it in insolvency terms and in terms of trends, the last time there was an insolvency spike, so a great number of people filing insolvencies in Canada, was 2009-10. And typically you'd see probably a 5 to 6 year cycle where you'd see another spike. Okay, so we could have normally or organically seen around mid-decade, 2015, 2016, another spike in insolvency filings, and we didn't. It was dead. And that's because when money's free, consumers have a lot of runway and a lot of resources by which they can keep themselves out of trouble, move things around, shuffle the chairs on the deck kind of thing. And so some of this has been a gradual buildup. So there's just been a lot more debt built up. Now, we had a bit of a pause with COVID with a certain cohort of people where they were working from home and their expenses dropped like crazy. So they saved and they paid down debt. But aren't we back right where we were before and more, right? Based on the 100 billion credit card.
Because I think there was a lot of pent up demand to go out and have some fun.
Exactly. Yeah, sure there was. And so, but we're back to sort of where we were. And then the rate increases didn't start till early 2022. So you had a period of about a year there. And as you know, I'm sure rate increases tend to take about 18 months or more to kick in to have an actual feel effect. And so some of this was that there was no natural credit reckoning in mid-decade because of the low interest rates. Okay. And that's a thing that not enough people talk about, I think. And we got here by getting too much debt because it was too easy. And then when rates went up, well, guess what? Right. All of a sudden, all that debt just costs a lot more. And it's very hard to fake your way through that.
So I think this is compounded by a couple of other factors, and maybe you can comment on that. Number one, housing prices have gone up. And so therefore the amount of debt that we've got has gone up commensurate with those increase in housing prices. Excuse me. I also understand that in Canada versus, the past and versus the United States elsewhere, we've got a far higher proportion of variable interest rate debt, which may have made sense back in the back 10 years ago when short-term rates were so low. But right now with a negative yield curve, an inverted yield curve, and high interest rates, it's really hurting people. And then number three, I understand that 50% of all mortgages come due in the next 2 years. Yeah. And so these are people in 2024 and 25 that would have gone for their mortgage in 2019 and 2020. And in 2019 and 2020, interest rates are low. And so therefore these people are going to be coming to maturity and are going to be seeing potentially a 300% increase in their interest bill. And so bottom line, isn't it going to get worse?
Well, that's the problem now, isn't it? Right. For the next, and I'm glad you mentioned the multiple year rollout here, because that's what we're faced with. If you took all mortgages and they all come due within 5 years, that's 20% per year. Okay. So next year, 2024, stands to reason that 20%, 1 in 5 Canadian mortgage borrowers is going to face a rate increase at time of renewal, and then another 20 and another 20 and another 20. So this could be a very prolonged rollout of kind of a reckoning here. And I realize rates will probably go back down and settle over time, but it's going to take time. And a lot of people will get trapped in that middle part where, like you said, they took variables and now I've met with people whose mortgages have gone up $1,000, $1,200. It's very hard to fake that. I mean, if you had given anybody another expense increase other than their mortgage that was $1,200, they'd faint. And so Canadians will always pay their mortgage, so other things will slide. So they'll start to not pay their credit card bills as often or whatever, because you can get away with that more than losing your house. So I think you will see a couple things. Is you'll see a cohort every year where they just can't get around it as their mortgage renewal comes due because their income's the same and they were living paycheck to paycheck before or close to it, and they can't absorb that increase. And then you will see people who are starting to fall behind on payments, because a lot of people that I meet with, even at the doorstep of insolvency, are current. Like they're right up to date on their payments and their credit score is very high. I also wrote about this, but it just shows you how focused the credit reporting industry is on payments, because you could have a absolute metric ton of debt, okay, but if you're making your payments, you got an 800 score. So that masks a lot of things too, I think, because when you go to get a mortgage, they say, "Oh, good, your score is great." Well, yeah, okay, but there's this massive debt behind you, and so at some point, I think that has to shake out of the system because there's no other way around it. And I will see this roll out over 2 or 3 years as people's rates come or mortgages come up for renewal, and also it tends to take homeowners longer to come and see us than it does renters, and I'll explain. Homeowners have a lot more, I guess, resources to them financially to keep themselves afloat. Most of that in the past, though, in past decade, was the home equity lines of credit. Well, banks are clamping those down now because as banks retrench and increase loan loss provisions and all this other stuff, one of the things that they do, one of the levers they pull, is cutting people off of credit. So if you don't have those avenues by which to get yourself out of trouble anymore, you're also going to see additional number of people who are going to have to do something.
Sounds like we're in for a reckoning.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Like like I said, we kind of dodged one mid-decade because of low rates. So I think I don't see how else. I mean, the only bar stool still holding up here is the job picture, right? Employment's still pretty good. And if that goes, then I think we're going to have a real problem. But even if it doesn't, I don't see how that doesn't mean there isn't all this debt out there. And I think that's the big underlying problem.
So you talk about employment still being, high and unemployment being low. Based on, current statistics, it looks like we're either in a recession or about to go into a recession. And during recessions, unemployment typically rises fairly dramatically. And at the same time, we just have done yesterday an interview with top, critique of government debt and deficits, saying that we're so over indebted at a national level that we can't afford to put other, new programs out there. And so therefore, government can't help us in a recession the way that governments would typically have wanted to help. So if you got government that's too indebted and people that are too indebted and interest rates that are high and inflation that is high and job losses start to incur, what's the prognosis?
Well, it's hard to fake a job loss. And I think if the job losses really hit, that'll be a big problem here because, it's that is not an impact that a household can sustain, frankly, even if it's not indebted, and they are indebted. So I think what you're going to see is a lot of consumer proposals filed in the next few years, frankly, because a lot of homeowners will get pulled into this or sucked into this situation where they wouldn't have been before, which is what I described earlier. And so, you will end up, when you have a house, you don't want to do bankruptcy because your house is there and you have equity in the house probably, and you do want to skip that. And so a proposal allows you to keep your house and still make a settlement with your unsecured creditors. And I think that's what you're going to see people having to do to a great extent as they are faced with mortgage renewals they can't handle. Maybe people have bought, things like pre-built condos that can't close because of appraisals dropping. There's all kinds of things happening out there in the housing industry that wasn't even a thought 18 to 24 months ago.
Well, I want to come back in a couple of minutes to exactly how one goes through doing this consumer proposal that you talk about. But
sure,
let's stay on the problem for a second here.
Mm-hmm.
How did we get into this situation? So you said that, we had these 3 generational events,
Mm-hmm.
but we had to have had a problem before that. And what is it? We just have too much of an appetite for debt?
That might be it, actually. And that was when I made some other notes here before this. But I think we got, a prolonged period of free money, low interest rates, tends to make people feel pretty good, and that's good. But it also reduces their ability to adapt, I think. And I think a lot of people right now that I'm meeting with are very shocked at what's happening. And it's like a slap in the face almost. They were, because they were doing fairly well. They got into houses that they probably wouldn't otherwise have been able to get into before. Those houses went up, every month in equity over a period of a few years, and things were great. But I think it masked a lot of fundamentals. And I mean, you're a businessman. I always say that debt is the killer of cash flow, and cash flow is the killer of businesses. And a household is kind of like a business. You got to make your bills every month. You don't have to make payroll, but you have to ensure that you are covered in the case of some kind of an event. And a lot of households now are at the point where they can't do that. And so, we got here over a prolonged period of time. And I think the psychology of this is interesting in the sense of what we were talking about a minute ago is people have gotten used to things being, relatively easygoing. And so now we're going to have a period where, that last decade is going to get flipped. And a lot of people are going to be faced with things that they weren't expecting. And it takes a bit of an impact, I think, on people stress-wise. Like a lot of this stuff is psychosomatic. When I meet with people, a lot of them are not well, certainly psychologically, possibly physically too. And debt is a great drain on your mind. It's a drain on your family. It's a drain on your household. And so I think a lot of people are going to have a tough time getting used to this new reality, I guess, as opposed to what we had in the 2010s.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes and talk about consumer proposals. And if you needed to do one, how do you actually do that? And how could Scott help us? Probably something none of us want to talk about, but probably something that we need to be a little bit aware of and prepare for, and hopefully prepare for before we ever come close to it, so we don't have to actually meet Scott across the table. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking about the threat of insolvency, debt, credit card debt, mortgage debt, and what happens if you get into a tough financial situation personally. Our guest is Scott Terrio. He's a manager of consumer insolvency at Hoy's. Michaelis?
Yep.
Licensed insolvency trustees. They're the largest independent consumer insolvency firm in Canada. Scott's been talking about how we've gotten into this situation, and it seems to be that we had a lot of debt to start with, that low interest rates during the last decade got us sort of seduced into buying bigger homes and putting on more debt. And then we got hit by, 3 generational deals, as Scott has described. Number 1, COVID. Number 2, high interest rates. And number 3, inflation. And I really worry that with the potential of a recession, it's going to get worse because we're going to have higher unemployment. People are losing jobs, banks, consulting firms. Lots of people have been announcing layoffs recently. And I think that AI may impact that a little bit more. And then at the same time, we're going to be faced with mortgage renewals. 50% of all mortgages are going to come due in the next 2 years. And people are going to get shocked at what happens to their mortgage bills as that comes due. So I think this problem that Scott's been talking about may only get worse. And we got this situation that during this recession, governments are tapped out and they're not going to be able to help us. And our marginal tax rates are the highest in the G7. So we're overly taxed. Governments are overly indebted. They can't help us out. We're overly indebted and interest rates are high and people are going to start losing their jobs. Sounds like a pretty bad prognosis. Maybe good for your business, Scott. If someone has a financial challenge and they come to see you, what's the process?
Well, they call us. We have a meeting with them, whether it's in person or on the phone or by video, whatever, fairly quickly, because there's no point in waiting at that point, because we also measure that typically from the time a person realizes they are in the kind of trouble that they can't fix until they actually call us is still a 12 to 24 month period. So there's quite a lag time in there. But they call us, we meet with them. I do 5 or 10 of these a day, and we say, okay, what's the problem? How much do you owe? Who do you owe it to? What do you own? What are your assets, right? What's your job? What's your income, family situation, all that stuff. And they're quite forthcoming with all that information. And we say, okay, well, let's see what we can do here. Our firm files personal bankruptcies and consumer proposals. That's all we do. And consumer proposals have risen in percentage of filings dramatically in the last 10 years or 15. And, it's nothing for me to do 9 out of 10 of my files or proposals at this point in a month. And that's because a proposal is just a legal settlement with your unsecured creditors, right? So you come to me, you say, look, typically our clients owe between 50 and 70,000 in unsecured debts. So that's credit cards, unsecured lines of credit, tax debt, payday loans, that kind of thing, unsecured personal loans. We say, okay, well, a proposal doesn't affect your assets, or they're not involved like a bankruptcy. Okay. So if you have a house with equity, but you got a ton of consumer debt, like 70,000 is typically what a homeowner presents with us with in terms of consumer debt, unsecured, then you want to keep your house, but you got to make a deal with your creditors. And so you can still do a consumer proposal on your unsecured debts, because it doesn't include your mortgage, your car loan, all that stuff. Those are secured debts. The lender has that asset if you don't pay. But it gets you out of your unsecured debts, and you have to it's a 5-year deal. So over 60 months, you offer your unsecured creditors X $100 a month to something that is acceptable and palatable to them, because they'd rather get a percentage return on that debt than have you go bankrupt and get less, because proposals always provide the creditors more than a bankruptcy. It's just over a longer period of time. Okay. And again, the assets don't come into play, because if you have a house with equity and you file bankruptcy, I go on title as the trustee for that house, and my job's to sell the house and pay the creditors, and you're out of your house. Sorry, you might have equity left over after, but you got no house. So you want to avoid that situation, and bankruptcy is an avoidable situation if you can avoid it anyways, because there's a much softer impact to your credit by doing a proposal. So if the creditors get to vote on the proposal, okay, so if you owe $50,000 in credit card debt, every dollar you owe is one vote in the proposal. So it's like an election. You need 51% of the dollars owed to say yes, the proposal goes ahead, even for those who dissented. Okay. So banks do a lot of these, and they're used to them. It's a very summary situation. It doesn't take very long. And you end up keeping your house and making a payment monthly to the trustee that goes to the creditors. And it saves a lot of people. It saves their homes. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next little while. I mean, some of what you can offer in a proposal is due to, the equity in the house, your income, those kinds of things will drive up the cost of what you have to pay in a proposal to the creditors. But it's, like I said, it's a real lifesaver for people who want to keep their homes and get rid of their unsecured debts.
And in these proposals, these are legal documents that you draft, or a lawyer drafts, or what?
Yeah, no, it's the trustee does all of this in Canada. And in the States, it works a little differently. There's more lawyers involved, which I'm sure none of your listeners will be surprised by. More litigious country, but it's very summary. The trustee does everything. It's legal. It's a legal proceeding, because a consumer proposal is actually a provision in the Bankruptcy Act in Canada. It's part of the code. So it's legal. You get legal release from the debts in a proposal, just like you do in a bankruptcy, but you don't get any of the credit impact that you would get in a bankruptcy. So in a way, it's a good way out for a lot of people.
And does the interest bill still continue to accumulate?
Nope, interest stops. And it includes tax debt. The interest just stops. So what you do is you go from being on this interest hamster wheel, to having a payment that is exactly this amount over exactly this amount of months, and that's it. So there's a finish line. And I think a lot of people will go from feeling there's no finish line to having a finite set deal in place. And that, I think, not only financially but psychologically helps people a lot, because they go from being like, I'm never going to do this. Because have you ever looked at the estimated time to pay that's on your credit card bill? and you only owe 5,000, it says estimated time to pay, 240 months and 6 days, or like, it's outrageous, right? Like, and that's the effective interest. And so not the least of this deal is that there's no interest. It's also fully open terms. So the 60 months you can pay earlier if you're able to, because it's just a settlement, right? Creditors get paid sooner if you're able to slowly, gradually pay that down quicker. I think that's just going to be something there's going to be huge uptake on in the next few years, because
Why would the credit card
homeowners.
companies agree to this if they're giving up their 18% interest?
Because if you go bankrupt instead, they're going to get a lot less. It's a business decision.
And so really what you're doing is you're threatening them that you're going to go bankrupt. So they've got
essentially, yeah,
they got to do the assessment that says there's a reasonable prospect.
Yeah, but they also know that, right? The banks do these every day. They have people who administer these things every day. And when they get a proposal, what they're looking for is to get as much as they can in the proposal. It's over 5 years instead of bankruptcy's a shorter period. So that's why we say, well, if we calculate a hypothetical bankruptcy based on the factors you present me, your home equity, if there is any, your income, that kind of stuff, bankruptcy is like a formula. You would get this much. If this person with all these factors did a bankruptcy, they would get this much, the creditors. So we give the creditors this much more in a proposal. And then that's why they'll take it, because they're going to get more. And they, somebody else is doing the work. Trustees doing all the work. We just get the dividends, and it's not a bad deal.
You talked about the tax man. How does the tax man come into play with this, both in creating the life altering event, as well as can you negotiate with the tax man?
Yeah, so tax is just a debt like all other debts in Canada when it comes to our insolvency system. So you hear things about, like, a lot of the information that we get that I would call tribal knowledge from the internet it unfortunately comes from the States. And so a lot of people think the same thing applies here. And it's totally different insolvency code. Any kind of personal income tax, HST owing from a business, that's director liability debt, payroll tax, same thing, is all completely dischargeable in a bankruptcy or proposal in Canada. And there's no special anything for CRA in terms of voting. They're just one amongst all the credit card companies. And so we used to see tax debt in something like a third of our filings. So in other words, we do, say we do 3,000 files a year or something, I don't know what. And a third of those would involve tax debt in some way, whether it was the whole tax situation, tax problem, or it was part of it. Now that's more like up to half. And some of that's to do with COVID benefits, because the initial round of CERB, if you recall, was paid in gross dollars, not net, because they just want to shovel money out the door as people were losing their jobs instantly. And then the problem is, CRA is now back on the warpath and coming after people for those things. And then the business benefit ones are similar. And so that's driven it up to a large extent. So like a larger proportion of the overall debt that's presented to us is higher now than it used to be. And as I said, a lot of people owe tax debt. And when they come to us, it's funny because I'll ask them, okay, give me your list of debts. And they will. They'll say, oh, okay, RBC Visa, BMO, MasterCard, TD line of credit, student loans, whatever. And they'll forget the tax. And I'll say, do you owe any tax debt? Where are you at on taxes? Oh, yeah, I'm behind a couple of years, and they said I owe them $6,000, but we can't include that, right? I'm like, yeah, we can. So there's a wide misunderstanding here that taxes can be included in these things, and that's going to help a lot of people in the next little while because of this tax debt increase that we've seen.
You said CRA is on the warpath. I've been hearing more and more about that. Is CRA taking a far more aggressive stance today than they have in the past?
More than I've seen in 14 years by a long shot. And like we get, as I said, we get front row seats for this. So we see what CRA has done, and CRA's powers are wide and deep. They can do a lot. When you owe tax money, they can do a lot to you to get your attention or to get your money or both. And what the issue right now is that for a year or so during COVID, CRA was the government's arm. They were Santa for the government, giving out. They were what the government used to dish out money to people. So CRA was put in this weird position of being, the giver of benefits to people, small businesses, everything. And then, last year at some point, I'd say about a year, and where are we at here? December, year and a half ago, summer of 2022, we saw kind of a turn in CRA's behavior. in the sense that what you said, they're going after people and it's noticeable. Um, they're pulling every lever they can almost to recoup what tax is owed to them. So you not only have banks who are in a very collection mode right now, because remember the courts were closed for a year and a half. And the only way banks can come after you if you're not paying them is through the courts. They can take money out of the bank account if you bank with them still. But if you're not banking with them, the only thing they can do is garnish your wages or freeze your bank accounts. The only way they can do that is through the courts. Well, the courts were closed for 18 months. And so now banks, once the courts reopened and life kind of came back to normal post-COVID, banks sent their lawyers to court to go after all those files, hundreds of thousands of files of delinquencies. So you not only have the banks going after people, but you have CRA going after people. In some cases, it's both. If you're that person that owes both, you've got two collectors, two lawsuits from two banks, and CRA has frozen your bank account and sent you a requirement to pay letter and all this stuff. So people are really getting a lot of phone calls these days, I guess.
What's the solution?
Well,
don't go into debt.
If you owe banks and CRA, you got a problem. If you owe them both, because of what I just said, they can shut you down, right? CRA can freeze your bank accounts, they can garnish your wages, and there's no maximum. People say, well, CRA can only garnish 30% of your wages. There's nothing in the tax code that says that. They can take as much as they want. Last week, I saw them freeze a bank account of a woman on welfare. So these stories, the stuff is very aggressive right now, and it's very hard to negotiate because the banks will get a wage garnish. If they go to court and you owe them, they'll get it. I mean, there's a 3-step process: statement of claim, judgment hearing, execution. But over 90 days or something like that, they will get their 20% wage garnishee. And the problem with the wage garnishee is not only is it embarrassing, and does it take 20% off the top of every paycheck you get, but it still includes interest. So it's going to take a long time if you owe multiple creditors for you to pay that off via the wage garnishee. And it's very hard to live like that. So, a proposal or bankruptcy stops all of that. And I think a lot of people just want that, if nothing else. Like, they can't take this anymore, right? Wage garnishee is usually, if you're in that 12 to 24 month period where you're not calling us yet, Brian, because you can't bring yourself to do it, and you get a wage garnishee notice, you call us. It's immediate. And so, you need help from somebody, and the only way to get a wage garnishee lifted or a stay of proceedings is to file a proposal or bankruptcy.
Scott, if people need your help, how do they contact you?
Hoyes, Michaelis and Associates, www.hoyes.com. We're everywhere. I mean, we have a website filled with information that's educational. We spend a lot of resources on that. We have a podcast, Debt Free and 30, shameless plug, that comes out every week on Saturday that Doug hosts, and he talks about everything under the sun in terms of consumer debt, educational. Again, we think our feeling is that this is something that should be taught in the schools when you're 18 or 20 instead of just turned out in the world and hope for the best. I wish I'd known a lot of this stuff when I was 18 or 20, frankly, but I came to it later. And yeah, we're very friendly. This doesn't have to be a weird or awkward thing. In fact, a lot of people say, geez, your job must be really depressing. And it's the exact opposite. We're the only people that have helped somebody in a long time. When they call us, they're like, okay, I'm ready to just do this, like unload. And so at the end of each day, I'm tired, but I feel good. So,
Scott, really appreciate you educating us on this issue, the challenge that we've got with these 3 generational events that we've talked about: COVID, interest rates, and inflation. The fact that we've got debt that's so high, twice on a personal level what it is in the United States, and the threat of what's going to happen in the future with mortgage renewals, and probably with a recession, increased unemployment, and that these life events just keep on happening. And, you went through a couple of these life events, but there's, a whole list of them that you identified that are things that, we don't expect. And they keep on happening, whether they be divorce, job loss, death in the family, et cetera. And we've got to be we got to be better prepared for them. So really appreciate you chatting with us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Brian.
I'm going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Thank you, Scott.